There is something the avoidant did not anticipate. They anticipated the hurt, had prepared, however unconsciously, for the expression of it. They anticipated the pursuit, had the management strategies ready for the reaching out, the attempts at reconnection, the requests for explanation that never quite get the explanation they deserve. They anticipated the anger, had the rationalizations preloaded for the moment it arrived, the ready-made story about why the anger confirmed the distance was necessary. What they did not anticipate, and what is currently doing something to their interior that the entire architecture has no adequate response to, is your silence. Not the silence of someone who has given up, not the silence of someone who is too broken to speak, not the performance of moving on, designed to produce a specific reaction, the silence of someone who has understood, who has looked at the full picture of what happened between you with clear, unhurried, completely unsentimental eyes, and decided, from that looking, that the picture speaks entirely for itself without requiring a single additional word from you. That silence is the thing they cannot stand. And understanding why, understanding the specific psychologically precise reason why your silence lands on the avoidant with more weight than anything you could have said, is what this entire examination is about. Not to give you a strategy, not to suggest that the silence is a tool being used against them, but to give you the genuine understanding of what is actually happening in them, in response to the most honest thing you have ever communicated to the dynamic, which is your complete, settled, genuinely arrived at withdrawal from it. Begin with what the avoidance system was built to manage, because the architecture, for all its sophistication and all its decades of refinement, was built to process specific inputs. It was built and optimized for the management of pursuit, the pursuit of someone who is still invested, still hoping, still reaching across the distance with the specific quality of someone who needs something from the avoidant. This is the primary input the architecture was calibrated to handle. It knows exactly what to do with pursuit. It creates more distance. It manufactures ambiguity. It generates the specific managed coolness that makes the pursuing person feel simultaneously drawn forward and held at arm's length in a way that perpetuates the dynamic indefinitely. The architecture processes pursuit without significant internal cost. It was built to manage anger. Anger is, in some ways, even easier for the architecture to process than pursuit, because anger provides the avoidance system with the external justification it is always looking for and never has enough of. The angry person confirms, through the anger itself, the story the architecture was constructing, that the relationship was too much, too intense, too emotionally volatile, too exhausting to sustain. Anger is not just manageable for the avoidance system. Anger is fuel. It feeds the retrospective revision. It makes the distance feel not just understandable, but genuinely necessary. The architecture takes anger and converts it into justification with the efficient automaticity of a machine that has performed this specific conversion many times before. It was built to manage grief. Visible grief, openly expressed, produces in the avoidant a complicated mixture of guilt and retreat. The guilt activates the shame activates the distancing. The grief becomes evidence of the relationship's emotional weight, and the emotional weight becomes evidence of the need for space. The architecture knows this cycle intimately, has run it across enough previous relationships to have refined the processing to something close to automatic. Grief is painful to encounter, but it is manageable. It has a protocol. What the architecture was never built to manage, what has no established protocol, no refined processing sequence, no ready-made response that the system can deploy, is a person who simply stopped, who withdrew not in anger, not in performed indifference, not in the visible hurt that gives the architecture something to respond to, but in the genuine, settled, undemonstrative quiet of someone who no longer requires anything from the avoidant. Not explanation, not apology, not the acknowledgement that they were wronged, or the satisfaction of being seen to have been treated poorly, not even the relief of the avoidant finally understanding what they lost. Nothing. The genuine, complete, entirely non-dramatic quality of a silence that is not waiting for anything, that has, simply, moved on. The reason this particular silence is unbearable to the avoidance system is not psychological complexity. It is something much simpler and much more devastating. The silence removes the noise that was covering the mirror, and the mirror, now uncovered, is showing the avoidant something they have been working very hard not to see clearly. Throughout the dynamic, throughout the full arc of whatever existed between you, in all its warmth and withdrawal and genuine connection and managed distance, the avoidance behavior was taking place against the background of your responses to it. Your hope, your hurt, your pursuit, your patience, your attempts to understand and to work with the architecture rather than against it. All of this was producing a kind of relational noise that surrounded the avoidance behavior and gave it context. Your responses were, without either of you designing them to be, a form of cover. They distributed the dynamics quality across two people. They made the avoidance behavior look like one half of an interaction, rather than what it actually was. The systematic, fear-driven, disproportionate management of a person who was doing nothing except attempting genuine intimacy. Your silence removes the cover. With nothing to respond to, with no pursuit to manage, and no hurt to retreat from, and no anger to convert into justification, the avoidant is left alone with the unmediated record of their own behavior, what they actually did, what they actually chose, the specific moments they chose, distance over presence, management over honesty, the regulated comfort of their own defended equilibrium over the genuine needs of someone who was investing in them with real, specific, irreplaceable care. And the record without the cover of your responses is not flattering. The hot and cold behavior that felt, from the inside of running it, like reasonable emotional self-regulation, looks, from the outside of your silence, like the behavior of someone whose responses to ordinary closeness were calibrated entirely around their own comfort, rather than around any genuine consideration of the other person's experience. The devaluation that arrived at the exact moment something real was developing between you, which felt, while it was running, like honest reassessment, looks, in the clean reflection of the silence, like the automatic, fear-driven generation of exit material that it actually was. The intimacy sabotage at the moments of greatest genuine connection. The withdrawal of warmth precisely when its consistent presence was most needed. The fault-finding that intensified as the depth increased. All of it sitting in the mirror, without distortion, without the noise of the dynamic's ongoing activity to soften the edges, just the record, just the behavior, just the specific detailed person-directed reality of what the architecture produced when it was pointed at someone who deserved better than what it was capable of offering. The exposure produces something the avoidance system is genuinely not equipped to handle without significant discomfort. Self-confrontation, not the managed, appropriately distanced, cognitively held self-awareness that the avoidant has always been capable of. The kind that says, I have avoidant tendencies. I find intimacy challenging. I need more space than most people. And that is then filed and moved past without producing significant disruption. That kind of self-awareness is the architecture's domesticated version of self-knowledge. It acknowledges the pattern at sufficient remove to prevent the acknowledgement from landing at the level where it would actually require something. The self-confrontation the silence produces is different in kind. It arrives not through intellectual reflection, but through the specific, felt, bodily encounter with the record of one's own behavior toward a specific person who has now, through the specific quality of their silence, communicated that they understood what that behavior was. The avoidant is not encountering a description of avoidant behavior patterns. They are encountering the memory of specific things they did and didn't do in the specific context of a specific relationship with a specific person whose silence now carries the weight of complete understanding. That specificity is what makes the self-confrontation unavoidable in a way that general self-awareness never manages to be. General self-awareness can be acknowledged and then filed. The specific memory of specific behavior toward a specific person who is now sitting in the silence of complete understanding, that memory does not file. It returns with the persistent, patient frequency of something that is looking for resolution and cannot find it, because the resolution it requires is the one thing the architecture was constructed to perpetually defer. The architecture's response to this level of self-confrontation is predictable. It reaches for its standard tools: rationalization, retrospective revision, the reconstruction of the narrative that redistributes responsibility more evenly across both people, the search for evidence that the behavior was justified by something real in the dynamic, rather than by the simple, unflattable truth of the avoidance fear running against something that threatened it. But the tools require material, and your silence has removed the material supply. The retrospective revision requires ongoing confirmation. It requires the evidence of your anxiety, your pursuit, your emotional expression, to keep the story populated with current confirmation that the distance was necessary. In the silence, the supply chain for that evidence has been completely cut. The narrative reaches for current confirmation and finds none. The story that the relationship was too demanding has no current demands to point to. The story that you wanted too much has no current wanting to reference. The story that the space was necessary has no current invasion of the space to justify. What the narrative finds, reaching into the silence for the material it needs, is its own echo, which is not material. It is the absence of material. The clean, quiet, completely undeniable absence of anything external that the architecture can use to sustain its preferred account of why things are the way they are. And an architecture running on echoes is an architecture running on nothing, which means the self-confrontation, deprived of its standard exits, keeps returning, keeps presenting the unmediated mirror, keeps asking in the specific language of what is felt in the body rather than what is thought in the mind. The question that the noise of the dynamic was always covering: was the distance really wisdom? Was the space really necessary? Was the self-sufficiency really genuine? Or was all of it the specific, expensive, relationship-ending performance of a person who learned to be afraid of the exact thing they needed most and deployed that fear against someone who was offering precisely what the fear was afraid of? The question, landing in the body rather than the mind, produces a specific physical experience, not emotional breakdown. The architecture is still present, still functional, still producing the managed surface presentation of someone who is fine. But beneath the presentation, a quality of discomfort that has a specific character. It is the discomfort of someone who is not where they said they wanted to be, who constructed, with considerable psychological effort and considerable interpersonal cost, a situation that was supposed to produce regulated equilibrium, and who finds, in the constructed situation, not the equilibrium, but the specific, persistent, body-registered unease of someone who did the wrong thing and cannot quite fully suppress the knowing of it. The architecture calls this many things: restlessness, general dissatisfaction, the ordinary fluctuation of mood, anything except what it is, which is the consequence, the specific personal, self-generated consequence of having run the fear against something real and produced, through that running, the loss of something genuinely irreplaceable, the consequence arriving not as external punishment, but as internal reality, the specific discomfort of a psychology sitting in the outcome it created and finding the outcome less comfortable than the fear promised it would be. Your silence is not creating this discomfort. It is simply refusing to cover it. The dynamic's noise, your responses, your engagement, your emotional expression, was always providing a layer of cover over the consequence, something for the architecture to focus on and respond to and manage, that kept the internal attention from settling too long on the record of its own behavior. Your silence removes the distraction, leaves the architecture alone with the consequence it created, and the consequence, with adequate uninterrupted attention, is genuinely uncomfortable. This is what the title means when it says your silence is exposing how crazy they are. Not a clinical judgment, not a characterization designed to wound. The specific, Descriptive recognition that behavior driven entirely by fear, behavior that dismantles genuine connection at the exact moments of its greatest realness, that withdraws warmth with a precision calibrated entirely around the avoidant's own regulated comfort, that generates fault-finding and ambiguity and comparative elevation, not in response to genuine problems, but in response to the specific neurological threat signal of genuine intimacy. That behavior, viewed in the undistorted mirror of someone's genuine silence and complete understanding, looks disproportionate in a way that is difficult to explain as anything other than the operation of something the conscious mind was not fully in control of. The avoidant knows this. That is the specific, inescapable, silence-produced discomfort. Not that you are judging them as crazy, that the record of their own behavior, sitting in the clean mirror your silence provides, looks to themselves like the behavior of someone whose responses to love were out of proportion to what love actually required, like the behavior of someone whose fear was making decisions that the person themselves would not have endorsed if the fear had been less loud, like the behavior of someone who was, in the most honest assessment, not fully in charge of themselves in the moments that mattered most. That recognition that the fear was running something that produced real harm to a real person, and that the running of it was not fully chosen and not fully stoppable and not fully legible to the person it was running through, is the beginning of the genuine self-knowledge that the architecture has always been protecting against. Because genuine self-knowledge of this kind requires the specific, uncomfortable acknowledgement that the self-sufficient, reasonable, discerning identity that the architecture constructed is not the complete picture. That there is another dimension of the self, the frightened, defended, wound-driven dimension that was operating in the relationship in ways that the reasonable identity was not fully directing or endorsing. Your silence is making this visible, not through accusation, not through explanation, not through the skilled articulation of the dynamic psychology that you have clearly developed across the arc of your own understanding, simply through the quality of its presence, through the specific, eloquent, entirely wordless communication of someone whose understanding is complete and whose life has moved genuinely beyond the question of the avoidance reckoning. The complete understanding is the most confronting thing, because incomplete understanding leaves room, leaves the possibility that you didn't fully see what was happening, that the confusion persists, that there is still some version of the story in which the architecture's behavior was not as legible as the silence suggests it was. Incomplete understanding is manageable. It allows the avoidance system to maintain the story that the dynamic was complicated and both people were confused, and the outcome was the product of genuine complexity rather than the straightforward operation of fear against love. Your silence communicates completion. It says without words, and therefore more powerfully than words, that the complexity has been resolved, that the confusion cleared, that the dynamic, viewed from the sufficient distance of genuine understanding, was not actually complicated in the way the architecture's operation made it appear to be while it was running, that the fear was fear and the love was love, and the distance was the fear running against the love, and the outcome was the predictable product of that running, complete, clear, understood. The avoidant cannot revise this understanding because you are not present to have your understanding revised, cannot offer the alternative account that might introduce enough confusion to restore the complexity the architecture relies on, cannot deploy any of the tools that require your engagement to function. The completion of your understanding is a fact that exists entirely outside the architecture's reach, and facts outside the architecture's reach are the most uncomfortable facts available in the avoidance experiential world. What happens in the avoidant, living in the sustained exposure of your silence, follows the pattern of the architecture's deterioration under conditions it was not built to sustain. The rationalization keeps failing. The narrative keeps losing its material supply. The self-confrontation keeps returning with the persistence of something that is looking for resolution in a system that keeps deferring it. The body keeps registering the consequence in ways the cognitive management cannot fully override. And beneath all of this, beneath the failing rationalization and the exposed record and the persistent self-confrontation, something begins to stir that is both the most significant development available in this entire arc and the development that comes too late to change the specific outcome your silence represents. The genuine recognition of what was lost, not the managed, minimized, architecturally processed version of the loss that the system was running in the immediate aftermath. The actual, specific, irreplaceable quality of what you were, what you offered, what the connection with you made possible, and the avoidance interior that nothing else has made possible since, and that the comparisons keep confirming, is not available in equivalent form anywhere the architecture has looked. This recognition is the silence's deepest work, not the discomfort, not the self-confrontation, not the exposure of the behavior's fear-driven disproportion. Those are the surface work, and they are genuinely significant. But the deepest work is the gradual, evidence-assembled, suppression-resistant arrival of the complete picture. What was present, what was refused, what was lost, and what the losing, authored by the architecture's faithful operation of the fear, actually and permanently cost. The silence is building that picture, piece by piece, in the mornings before the management engages, and in the evenings when the distraction runs out, and in the specific unguarded, ambient moments where the suppression slips for a second, and what is underneath gets briefly, vividly, unavoidably through. You don't need to be present for this work to continue. It is happening without you, in the specific interior, architecture dismantling way that genuine consequence always eventually works, not from the outside, not through anything the person who was harmed needs to do or say or continue to provide, but from the inside, through the honest, body-level, increasingly undeniable accumulation of the cost of having run the fear against something that was, by every honest measure, genuinely worth staying for. The silence is the mirror. The mirror is clear, and what it is reflecting, the specific, personal, fear-authored record of the avoidance behavior towards you, is doing the work that nothing else could do in the only way it was ever going to be done, without you having to say a single word. That is the specific, quiet, completely genuine power of what you chose when you chose the silence. Not strategy, not performance, the honest expression of someone who understood completely, and whose understanding expressed in the most eloquent form available, the form that requires nothing and demands nothing and simply is, completely and finally, done, is the most confronting thing the avoidance architecture has ever had to sit with. And sit with it they do, every day, in the specific, uncomfortable, management-resistant reality of a mirror they cannot turn away from, because you are no longer there to give them something else to look at. The mirror doesn't stop working simply because the avoidant has learned to avoid looking directly into it. That is the specific, exhausting reality of what your silence continues to produce as it extends. Not a single confrontation that happens once and then resolves, but a sustained, ambient, inescapable reflective condition that the avoidance daily life keeps moving through. The mirror isn't in one place. It isn't in a specific conversation or a specific location or a specific moment that can be identified and avoided. It is in the quality of everything that is now happening in the avoidance relational life, in your absence, in every interaction that doesn't reach what interactions with you reached, in every moment of almost genuine connection that levels off before it arrives, in every morning that the management hasn't fully engaged yet and the mind goes where it genuinely wants to go, which is in your direction, before the architecture catches up and redirects. The mirror is everywhere the avoidant turns, and this pervasiveness is the specific quality of your silence that the architecture was least prepared for. The architecture knows how to manage a located threat. It has protocols for specific triggers, for running into you, for your name appearing somewhere, for the specific identifiable moments where the material of the loss is directly present. These protocols are imperfect but functional. They produce the familiar distancing response, the cognitive redirection, the deployment of whatever management tool is most available in the moment. What the architecture has no protocol for is a distributed, ambient, everywhere present reflective condition that is not triggered by specific encounters with you, but by the general quality of a life being lived in your absence. The mirror is not a specific object to be avoided. It is the texture of the avoidant's current relational experience itself, the specific, ongoing daily evidence that what existed with you was not replaceable by what exists without you. And a mirror that is the texture of daily experience cannot be managed away through the avoidance standard localized response protocols. It requires a different kind of response entirely, a response that the architecture was never built to generate. The response it was never built to generate is genuine sitting, the willingness to occupy the discomfort of the mirror's reflection without immediately deploying a management strategy to reduce the activation, to let the self-confrontation be present without rushing toward the rationalization that makes it bearable, to allow the record of the behavior to be what it is, not catastrophic, not the verdict of a fundamentally broken person, but the honest, specific, consequence-producing record of someone whose fear was making decisions their deeper self would not have endorsed, and to sit in that allowance long enough for it to produce the genuine self-knowledge that the architecture has always been protecting against. This sitting is the work, and it is the work that your silence, better than any other available condition, creates the necessity for, not because the silence demands it. The silence demands nothing, but because the silence removes every alternative. Every other available condition provides the avoidance system with something to manage, something to respond to, something to organize its attention around that allows the work to be indefinitely deferred. Your silence is the specific, rare, architecture-resistant condition of there being nothing else. Nothing to pursue, nothing to manage, nothing to respond to. Just the avoidant and the mirror, and the question of whether the sitting will happen. For many avoidants, the answer is not yet. The architecture generates sufficient distraction, sufficient busyness, sufficient forward momentum to defer the sitting indefinitely. The mirror is present, but it is not being looked into with any sustained honesty. The self-confrontation surfaces and is redirected before it reaches the depth where genuine revision would become available. The pattern continues. The loss is carried without being metabolized. The cost accumulates without being honestly acknowledged. But something happens over time that the architecture's deferral strategy cannot prevent indefinitely. The cost keeps accumulating, even when it isn't being acknowledged. The mirror keeps reflecting, even when it isn't being looked into. And the cumulative weight of the unacknowledged cost and the unexamined reflection eventually produces a specific kind of psychological fatigue that is different from ordinary tiredness and different from ordinary grief. It is the fatigue of maintenance, the specific exhaustion of a system that has been running its suppression and its rationalization and its retrospective revision at full capacity for an extended period without the processing that would allow any of those mechanisms to actually complete their work and reduce the load. The suppression that never processes doesn't reduce the material it is suppressing. The rationalization that never convinces completely doesn't eliminate the doubt it is rationalizing against. The retrospective revision that keeps failing to flatten the memories doesn't stop trying. All of this is running, continuously, consuming the psychological energy that the avoidance daily functioning requires. The fatigue of maintenance is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as a crisis or produce the visible collapse that might otherwise motivate intervention. It manifests as a gradual reduction in the quality of engagement with ordinary life, a slight flattening of response, a reduction in the specific aliveness that genuine investment in one's own experience produces, a quality of going through the motions that is not depression, exactly, but is the specific, sustained, energy deficit state of a system that is directing too much of its available resource toward the maintenance of a position it can no longer fully justify. The avoidant in this state is functional. They are not obviously struggling. They are showing up to their life and performing its requirements with sufficient adequacy that the performance is not visibly insufficient. But the quality of the showing up has changed in a way that is perceptible to anyone paying close enough attention. The specific aliveness is reduced. The genuine engagement is thinner. The investment in the texture of daily experience is lower. Something that should be more present is less present, and the something is the psychological resource that the maintenance operation is consuming. What this fatigue eventually produces, not always, not inevitably, but with a frequency that is higher than the avoidance conscious resistance to the process would suggest, is the lowering of the maintenance threshold, the point at which the cost of keeping the suppression running exceeds the cost of allowing the suppressed material to be felt, at which the exhaustion of the rationalization exceeds the discomfort of acknowledging what the rationalization was protecting against, at which the continued operation of the architecture against the self-confrontation requires more than the system currently has available to give it. When this threshold lowers sufficiently, what happens is not a dramatic breakdown. It is a quiet, often unexpected, frequently inconveniently timed encounter with the material that the maintenance operation has been working against. The avoidant is in an ordinary moment, not a prepared moment, not a moment they chose for reflection, not a moment with the appropriate emotional support surrounding it, and the suppression slips, and what is underneath gets through. With the full, unprocessed, accumulated intensity of everything that has been suppressed across the entire duration of the silence, these moments are genuinely destabilizing. Not because the material is unbearable. It isn't, though it is genuinely painful. But because the avoidant has no adequate framework for experiencing this specific kind of emotional intensity without the management being in place. The management has always been there. The emotional experience has always been filtered through it. Feeling something at full intensity, without the filtering, is a genuinely novel experience for a nervous system that has been running the filter continuously since early childhood. It is disorienting in the specific way that the unfamiliar is always disorienting. Not dangerous, but requiring a navigation capacity that hasn't been developed because it was never previously needed. What gets through in those moments has a specific content that is worth describing. It is not the generalized grief of a significant loss. It is more specific than that. It has your face on it, your particular quality of presence, the specific, sensory neurologically encoded memory of what it felt like to be in genuine connection with you, not the summary level memory that the management has been working with, but the granular, felt, specific moment memory that lives below the summary level and is encoded with the full emotional weight of the original experience. A specific conversation, a specific quality of an evening, the specific feeling of being understood without having to explain, not as a general description of a pleasant relational quality, but as the direct, re-experienced, present tense feeling of that specific thing happening in a specific moment. The avoidant is in the present moment and simultaneously in the full felt reality of a past moment with you, without the management that was always previously standing between the past moment and the full experience of what it contained. This is what the silence has been building toward, in the avoidance interior, across whatever duration the silence has lasted. Not a dramatic reckoning, not the theatrical confrontation with the self that transformation in movies always looks like. The quiet, specific, unglamorous, completely genuine arrival of the full felt weight of what was real between you. Arriving, finally, in a nervous system that has been running its maintenance operation against it for long enough that the maintenance operation no longer has sufficient resource to prevent the arrival. The arrival doesn't produce immediate action. The avoidant who has this experience does not, in most cases, pick up the phone in the moment of the experience and allow the feeling to translate directly into contact. The architecture reasserts, the management re-engages. The moment of full felt contact with the reality of the loss passes back into the suppressed state from which it briefly emerged. But something has changed in the passing. The threshold has been demonstrated. The material has been briefly felt at full intensity, and the nervous system has survived the feeling. And a nervous system that has once survived the full intensity of the suppressed material is a nervous system that has just received the most important piece of evidence in the reconditioning process. That the feeling is survivable, that the full felt weight of genuine loss, of genuine love and genuine regret and genuine self-confrontation does not produce the annihilation the architecture always insisted it would produce. That the interior, entered fully and without the management standing between the self and what the self contains, is not the unbearable place the architecture was always protecting against. It is simply the truth. Painful, specific, consequence-producing truth. But survivable. And survivable for a nervous system that has been organizing its entire defensive operation around the premise that the interior was not survivable is genuinely transformative information. Your silence produced this, not through any action or any intention or any strategy, through the specific, honest, genuine quality of having understood completely and having allowed that understanding to express itself in the most direct way available. By removing yourself from the dynamic entirely and allowing the dynamic's absence to do what the dynamic's presence never could. The dynamic's presence was always giving the architecture something to work with, something to manage and respond to, and use as the raw material for the ongoing regulatory operation that kept the avoidance internal pressure at a manageable level. Your silence removed the raw material supply. And without the raw material, the regulatory operation couldn't sustain itself against the weight of what it was always working to regulate. The architecture is running on empty. The maintenance is failing under its own exhaustion. And what is emerging from the failure, slowly, imperfectly, without the dramatic linearity of a story being told, is the genuine self-knowledge that the architecture was always protecting against, not because you forced it, because you stopped providing the conditions that prevented it, because you made the most honest choice available to you. The choice that said your own life, fully inhabited, is more worth investing in than the continued management of someone else's fear. And that choice, expressed in the silence that followed it, created the specific conditions under which the avoidance interior finally had to meet itself without the buffer of your engagement to stand between them. The self-knowledge that is emerging in the avoidant through this process is not comfortable and is not arriving cleanly. It is moving through resistance and management, and the architecture's repeated attempts to re-establish the cover it has lost, but it is moving in the specific direction that genuine consequence always moves, toward the honest acknowledgement of what was produced and what it cost, and what the producing of it says about the gap between the avoidance, genuine feeling, and their current capacity to act from that feeling in ways that honor it. That gap is the specific territory where genuine development lives. And the silence, your silence, maintained not as strategy but as the honest expression of where you arrived, is what created the conditions for the avoidant to finally, uncomfortably, productively, inhabit that territory long enough to begin understanding its geography. Not for your benefit. You are elsewhere now. Inhabiting your own life with the specific, earned, hard-won quality of presence that comes from having understood something completely and having chosen yourself fully on the basis of the understanding, for their own, on their own timeline, through their own process, in the specific, interior, nobody else can do it for them way that all genuine psychological development ultimately moves. The silence created the space. What they do in the space is the rest of the story. Your part was the silence, and the silence was enough. More than enough. It was, in the complete and honest accounting of everything it has produced and everything it continues to produce in the avoidance interior, exactly the right thing. The most honest thing. The thing that required the most of you to arrive at, and that has cost them the most to sit with, which is how it was always going to be. The most honest thing usually is both of those simultaneously, costly to choose and completely, permanently, irrevocably the right one.